And our next, last speaker in this session is Dr. Chen Bram. Chen Bram is an anthropologist and organizational psychologist. And in the last 2 years, he held the position of Schusterman Fellow of Israel Studies, teaching at the James Madison College of Public Affairs at Michigan State University, and previously at the University of Florida. Dr. Bram is also a research fellow at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem, where he served as a managing partner of the anthropological knowledge, relevance, use, and potential research group. Although that Dr. Bram is one, I think, of very few scholars who are studying the Jewish community in Central Asia. I don't know many of them, and not many so fine researchers and scholars as Dr. Bram is. And he conducted a long-term field work among the Jews of the Caucasus and Central Asia Jews. Currently is involved in a research on Jewish-Muslim relations, both in Central Asia and the Caucasus, and among Jewish immigrants and Arabs in a mixed Jewish-Arab town in Israel. And we're looking forward to hearing your talk, Neighboring Families, Religious Traditions and Intergroup Intimacy, Jews and Muslims in Soviet Central Asia. בבקשה.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. So we are doing a few shifts. One shift from American accent to a very local English accent. And a second shift. My paper concentrates on intergroup relations, not on Jewish identity, although you will see that Jewish identity is also there. And although the people that I will talk about have quite different, let's say, social ecology and challenges in their lives, some of the dilemmas that we heard from both distinguished speakers are quite similar. This is an ongoing study. And actually, I moved here from the Caucasus, and I spent years studying the Jews of the Caucasus, Caucasian Jews, which is an interesting category, especially in the United States, to Jews of Central Asia. So let me start with some introduction dealing with this surrounding. It was Saturday night at the end of May 1988. An inflamed mob tried to break down the gates of the Jewish cemetery. And you can see here the new gates. The crowd was hunting people who sought refuge inside the cemetery. Margelan is usually a peaceful settlement. The town lies on the ancient Silk Road, on the way from Samarkand and Bukhara, the main trade centers of Central Asia, leading to China, actually almost half the way to China. The assailants set fire to the gates, and the building near the entrance, which was soon completely burned, and along with them an exhibition with historical items and old photographs of the Jewish community. Once the mob managed to break into the cemetery, the fate of those who had sought refuge inside was sealed. This event was part of a process of ethnic cleansing taking place all over the Fergana Valley, a fertile land lying mostly in Uzbekistan. You can see Uzbekistan down here. 1 minute, let me see if I can use the arrow. Yeah, okay. So You can see the arrow? Okay. So you can see Uzbekistan down here, and you can see here some kind of almost like a half an island or something like this of Uzbekistan in between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Okay, here. Wait, I lost it. Okay, here. And this is the upper map. Okay, the upper map is the map of this area. Okay, Fergana Valley, Fergansky Dolina, Emek Fergana, or Ferhana במקור. Over 800 houses were burned, hundreds of people lost their lives. Thousands of Jews left the areas following these events, mostly heading to Israel. My current study is devoted to their story. And I'm going to leave my paper, although I have a written paper, I'm going to use some slides. And I got a lot of text also on the slides in order to deal with the limited time and just to talk with you about my study, although maybe the English will be a little bit more Israeli. Okay, so we are talking about Margelan, a small town, traditional town, with the, actually according to the tradition, Alexander Mukdon himself came to Margelan. About 100,000 people at the end of the 80s with Uzbek majority and with quite big Jewish community. Probably inside the city of Margelan, this was the biggest minority. If you're talking about all Fergana Valley, there were many other minorities, some of them as big and even bigger, like the Meskhetian Turks, who were actually transferred from the Caucasus, Koreans, Tatars, and others. And Margelan is just nearby Fergana. Fergana was the Tsarist Russian colonial administrative capital of the region. So there's some kind of contrast that was interesting for me between a very traditional town to a more Russian, Russified town nearby, and some of the Jews, of the local Jews, moved from Margelan to Fergana. Some moved back then from Fergana to Margelan, and so on. So this is basically a study of interviews with immigrants. These immigrants, most of them live today in Ramla. And Ramla, as you know, is a mixed town. And part of my study, I'm also interested what's happened to these Jews who used to live near Muslims in Central Asia, what happened when they are coming to a mixed town in Israel. But I will not talk about it now. You can ask about it later if you want. And actually, I want to start with an episode that have nothing to do with the interviews. And actually, this episode even helped me as an anthropologist to get to the field, because this is a traditional society and also a Soviet, post-Soviet society. So it's quite difficult for a foreigner to get into the field and to get trust from the people. What do you see here is actually a tour. I'm working here not only as an anthropologist, but as a tour guide. And I'm taking a group of people. And I convinced this group of people that actually we have a full day, and maybe instead of doing some other things, let's go to Margelan, because I was interested in Margelan. So I said, okay, let's go to Margelan. So we are walking in Margelan, and I'm looking for the Machala, the old neighborhood where the Jews used to live. And somehow I lost my way. It happened even to guides. Then we met a nice lady, maybe my age, something like this, you can guess. So, and I asked her, where is the Machala? She's looking at us. She recognized that we are Yevrei, Israelis, Jews. She's taking us to the Machala, and on the way, she's calling maybe 12 different women and tell them, hey, the Jews are coming, come out, greet them, come out, come and greet them, prepare something for them. Some of these women probably were busy and very surprised from this, but she insisted. So we came to some house, we were greeted with some fruits, local bread, some candies, some drinks, and at the end we got to the area where the synagogue used to be. And then something very strange happened. This young girl, maybe 15, 16 years old, is coming out, and she's handling me. She saw that I'm the nachalnik, the leader, and she's handing me a Talmud, מקראות גדולות. Very exciting moment. So we were very surprised. I took this מקראות גדולות, and I took it with me to Ramle, and I told the people in the synagogue from Magellan, okay, you left something. And they were very excited, and I told them, okay, you can take it to a geniza now. They said, no, we will put it in a box as a memory inside the synagogue. So the question here, why? Why this lady why did they keep it like this? Why did they greet us like this? Why they gave us this kind of old book? And this מקראות גדולות, this Talmud was not in a good condition. I mean, if it was a bus of some football players in Israel, maybe they would just throw it around from the windows, or maybe do something else. This was a surprise. And what I want to suggest here is a term. And I'm suggesting this term in order to interpret the relations between Jews and Muslims in Central Eurasia. In Central Asia, but also in the Caucasus, which is not our subject today. And for me, intergroup intimacy is actually relations characterized by close ties beyond ethnic boundaries. But it's not only close ties. It includes recognition of the other not only as a person, not only as an individual, but the other as a member of a different group. And it includes also, this is my definitions and my suggestions here, it includes also some knowledge of the other group's religious traditions and practices. Meaning that these people knew that you are not throwing this away. And they knew that this is important. And they kept it a few years. So, another example here. This quotation, this man was the most, let's say, somehow questionable about Jewish-Muslim relations from all my interviewers. All my interviewers actually said that we had very good relations with the Muslims. This man was a little bit more suspicious, but then, still, listen to his words. When we left, they approached us and said, we are sorry that you are leaving. I worked with Muslims in this way many years, face to face. Neighbors were always good, etc., etc. I'm not reading everything because we don't have enough time. So my idea of intergroup relation is corresponding with Michael Herzfeld's idea of cultural intimacy. Now, what is cultural intimacy in anthropology? There's Herzfeld, American Jewish anthropologist from Harvard, coined this term. And he's talking about some intimacy that all people from the same nation state have. So I'll give you one example. We had already 2 other lecturers, but only the third one left his jacket there. Very Israeli. It's hot. I don't want to stand here with a jacket, although I took a very nice jacket. Okay, so this kind of approach and my ability to talk about it with you, this is our cultural intimacy. And this kind of cultural intimacy can be interpreted, of course, as some kind of bluntness, not only chutzpah, even rudeness, but by outsiders. So this is cultural intimacy. I don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but I want to say that while Herzfeld is using cultural intimacy to talk about a relations reflecting cultural homogeneity and the project of the nation state homogenizing people, I'm talking about intergroup intimacy or intergroup cultural intimacy, while I want to explain how groups can have close relations while recognizing and allowing for differences, and how people stress a mutual social fabric, but also enhance ethnic boundaries and ethnic identity. So, again, I will not deal now with all this theoretical framework. We don't have time, but we can go back later on to this. And a few words about the background. I'm concentrated on the late Soviet socialism, after World War II, or the big patriotic, the grand patriotic war for Russian citizens. Alexei Yurchak wrote this very interesting book, Everything Was Built Forever Until It Was No More, about the collapse of the Soviet Union. And at this time, people already have their rules in Soviet society. Everybody, also in Margilan, in Fergana Valley, they were Soviets already. And most of them even believe somehow in socialism. But at the same time, they already develop all kind of mechanisms to cope with the system. And that was part of life. Now, in late socialism, especially 1958, 1960, 1962, new campaigns, anti-religious campaigns, some of them very cruel, very cruel. So this is part of the background here. But then, in the 80s, we have already the glasnost, the perestroika, and the rise of nationalism. And I hope you remember somehow the small introduction, the event in the cemetery. And I hope that you have some interpretation and you try to locate it vis-a-vis my other information here. So, the family in this surrounding for Muslims and for Jews, and when I'm talking about Jews now, I'm talking about local Jews, usually known as Bukhara Jews, although this is very far from Bukhara. The family was the most important site that enabled resistance to the anti-religious policies and to Russification. And rite of passages were very important here, especially circumcision and marriage. But if you wanted a honorable job, if you wanted to be, let's say, not only a teacher, but a junior manager in school, you couldn't circumcise your son. If you wanted any kind of management position, you couldn't do any kind of religious marriage. So if you want to adopt some kind of modernization, and you want also some social mobility, and Bukhara Jews wanted social mobility, and they were quite, let's say, successful group. You have to keep some things in some kind of a secret. And what is interesting here, that this experience was actually similar for Jews and for Muslims. So let's look on this, this monologue of Dina, who was a teacher. During the 8 days of Passover, we couldn't eat outside. Our close and friends would know that during Passover, I don't eat bread. We couldn't say that, though. As a Jew, I observed this. The synagogue was behind my house. My son was born. I did a circumcision at home. We couldn't publicly get to the synagogue to perform the circumcision. Not to the synagogue, not to the hospital. And again, don't think about Central Asia as some remote area. This is the 80s under Soviet rule, modernization everywhere. So Jews in the 80s here, their life was not so different from your life as for technology, communication, and so on. Okay? Don't think about it as some kind of traditional remote place. So, with us belonging to Judaism, everyone tried not to publicize it. But you know something? She's talking to me. This has a lot to do with the Muslims as well. All the Muslims who were living there were religious and went to the mosque, but they wouldn't publicize it because of their organizational belonging. At that time, Uzbekistan was Soviet, so it was the same for the Uzbeks. And this is the very foundation for intergroup intimacy. I know you are my manager, I'm the deputy. I know that you circumcised your son. And you know that I circumcised my son. And actually, maybe you came to my celebration and I came to your celebration. But we are both Soviets and we won't talk about it. Now, in these surroundings, we have also the Russians. There's Russians in Fergana, there's also Russians in Margilan. Just look on these symbols from Soviet times. So Novgorod, when we see now immigrants from the Soviet Union with trees, this is not Christmas. This is Novgorod, which is a civic celebration. But at the same time, it's clear for everyone that it has some Christian roots. So for Russian Christians, they could more easily identify with the Soviet civil culture. For traditional Jews and Muslims, there were some tensions here, although some of them also were influenced by Novgorod and by these symbols. But it was more important to them to preserve Jewish holidays. So look on this monologue, Ada. During Passover, I would always bring the kids matzah. We used to bake it ourselves along with some other goodies. Everybody loved our matzah. And she's saying how they put eggs inside the matzah and all kind of good things into the matzah. It's not our matzah here. It's a different kind of matzah. So, however, Russian kids accused us of putting blood in the matzah. We felt the anti-Semitism in school where most kids were Russians and Tatars. Dina, whom you met just 1 minute ago, also mentioned that there were some problems. For example, before Passover, there were these rumors. This is going back to 1962 blood libel. 1962, there was a blood libel, I think, but I have no proofs, that it was also driven by the KGB. And this blood libel had influence for years. But with the Muslims, no problems. With the Christians, Russians, and the Tatars, there were problems. Moreover, when Dina is coming to Israel, she's trying to reconnect to some of her classmates. And then she finds 2 kids in Odnoklassniki. Odnoklassniki is the Russian Facebook. And she recognized that these 2 kids were the worst with these kind of rumors, saying that, Jews are using blood. And she finds out that both of them are in Beersheba. And she's laughing, and she's saying they are good friends of mine now. So what we see here is very different strategies of Ashkenazi Jews and Bukhara Central Asian local Jews. And actually also Tatars were more like Ashkenazi Jews. They were Muslims, but closer to Russians. So it's not a binary situation. It's more complicated, but we don't have time for this. So local intergroup intimacy is actually located in the neighborhood, but also in the workplace, also in music and cultural production, and all kind of informal practices are very important in creating this kind of intimacy, and I will give you some examples. Neighborhood relations. 3 more minutes? What is it? 1 more minute. Okay, so now it's my time to negotiate. So there are some proceedings, and also I had to give some introduction. Everybody knows we're Germany and United States. Okay, so I hope I'll get 4 more minutes and I'll run. Okay. So this Frida is talking about how her mother, when she didn't want to eat, would take some meat and some dishes, give to the neighbor, and tell the neighbor, if you're cooking to your children, take this food. My child is playing with your children, and she will eat with your children. But she's giving her the meat, because the meat is kosher. Okay, so you see this kind of intergroup intimacy here, and this kind of ritual exchange involved also some kind of mellow resistance to the Soviet secularization, and it always keep also boundaries. I'm going to your wedding, you're coming to my wedding, maybe I'll announce that you are here. But if I announce that I have this very respectable Muslim guest and his daughter, all the other Jews will know that this daughter is someone to greet, not to flirt with. Okay, so very delicate mechanisms. And you can see, the Muslim neighbors, knew our holidays. Jewish physicians, again, we are talking about Bukhara Jews, don't mistake it. And other academics gave services to the Uzbeks, so they were close with them. We worked with the Uzbeks, we lived with them in the neighborhood, we went to their family celebrations, to funerals, and so on and so forth. And I'm finishing in 2 minutes. I'm getting back to the first episode. Who were there, these people inside the cemetery? The people who died this evening in 1988 in the cemetery. Now you can test yourself, depend on your historical framework of Jewish history. I assume that more than half of you were sure that these are Jews, but they were not Jews. They were Meskhetian Turks. The ethnic cleansing in Fergana Valley was ethnic cleansing of one Muslim group against another Muslim group. And this is a very interesting historical event, but it's not our subject. Tragic, horrible. And Meskhetian Turks, in a way, after, in the last 30 years, are the new Jews with their horrible fate. But we don't have time for this. I just want to acknowledge it. But after acknowledging this, what happened to the Jews? The Jews, most of the times, were protected by their neighbors. The neighbors came to the Jews and told them, put some kind of red sign on your door. Remember the Passover story? So when they are coming to burn the houses, they didn't tell them when they are coming to burn the house. Just put it. They told them and they did it. So you can see here, my brother was so worried, but to me as a Jew, no one approached, no one said, you're Jewish. No one hurt me or came close. Everybody knew who I am, the son of Eliyahu, the barber. So what do you see here, that intergroup intimacy between Jews and their neighbors, it's not some kind of romantic approach. It's everyday relations, but it's also enable or help to overcome problematic and dangerous events. The 1962 blood libel, the event was finished when the Jews and the local imam were going around and trying to find the kid. The Muslims helped the Jews. And all the blood labels in these areas were penetrated, the idea of blood label penetrated from Europe. And the even more dramatic events of 1989, 1990, Jews were protected, but they already lost trust because nationalism was on the rise. New people came to the cities, urbanization, they felt threat, and at the end they left. And this is my last slide. So they left. All of them left. And actually, Fergana Valley Jews were the pioneers of the 1990s immigration. And they immigrated in a time that they could still go to the United States. I don't know if you know this history. In 1990, the United States is changing their rules with some pressure from Israel. They could go to the United States, but they choose to go to Israel. They go to Ramla. They have a synagogue of their own in Ramla, of the Margelan Jews and other Fergana Jews, and they keep connection with Margelan and Fergana Valley. Some people that I interviewed, people who already went 5 times in the last 7 years. They have an internet site of the cemetery, and they employ an Uzbek worker. Actually, the previous one who was killed was the Meskhetian Turks. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Chen. You took us to very unknown terrain, which is really understudied, and it was very interesting. And you mentioned so many features that we can find them in different and similar communities, but also something very unique to this very community of the Uzbek Jews in Fergana. And maybe we can learn more when we ask some questions. The first question by Professor Sylvie Hijawi to all presenters: what kind of family you're talking about? How do you define the family that you are referring to in each one of your presentations? The second one by Mira Jungmann, single women in Germany. How do you explain the contradiction between this phenomenon of single women and Jewish values in German society? And third question by Uriel, okay, is to Marion, to please clarify the boundaries between culture and religion, okay? And this is to Marion. And to Adam, could you explain how the category of Yirei Hashem, how do you refer to it? Is it some kind of declaration of a more, or expression of a more confident Judaism, or does it show another kind of Jewishness or Judaism which is developing in the US, more or less, okay? Okay. And for the third question to Chen, missing is, Uriel is missing the term habitus to the general explanation of your life, of the life of Jews in Uzbekistan. And you have another, and Chen has another question to Adam. Would you please?
It was fascinating talk for me because in the last 2 years I'm involved on my time, not of any other specific academic institute, on a very intensive participant observation, or actually observant participation in American Judaism, which is actually for me liberal American Judaism and Chabad. This is what I have in my areas. And I do it already in the last 2 years in 2 different places and their surroundings. So for me, it was a little bit difficult, although it was so fascinating, and especially when talking to an Israeli audience, that you took reform and conservative as one category, liberal Judaism. As an anthropologist, I think that if one of the natives would be here, he would be quite, especially the conservatives, not the reform, would be a little bit angry. And of course, I would like to hear from you more about the different, and I know actually from the different places that I encountered, about the differences among the conservatives here, but I think this is something that you can highlight a little bit.
I have two questions for each of my co-lecturers. The first is to Adam about gay marriage. All right, I think there's a real distinction there between conservative reform and also the issue. It's becoming much more popular in the United States now. State after state after state is allowing it. So therefore, there will be men marrying men who are inter-religious, and the same with women marrying women. So that'll be a little easier for Jews. But still, it's an interesting thought. But it's so interesting to me about your lecture, the one on Uzbekistan, because everything you said about Muslim-Jewish relationships I could relate to in the villages of Germany, everything. And at the end, I was convinced that the Christians would have attacked the Jews, because that's what happens in the Nazi period, right? You have these close relationships based on understandings, the kinds of intimacy you're describing, neighborhood, schools, families, etc. But in the end, they turned against them. So I'm curious whether, if the Turks hadn't been there, is it possible they would have turned against the Jews? And it's just fascinating to me that they wouldn't. You're saying they wouldn't. And that relationship somehow was more powerful and more positive than what happened in Germany, and yet you could get the same. You could go to two villages in Swabia in 1910, and you'd have similar interactions. So it's really stunning to me.
I have a question, but I think I leave it because it would be too long. Maybe later we'll discuss it in the other place. I think maybe we do it at the end. The last one will begin, and then you will be the first, and Adam, and then Marion. And please, 5 minutes for each. Okay?
Thank you, Dr. Simon, for the habitus, and I think it's important, of course, and I will try to integrate it. But I think my answer for you and for Professor Kaplan, habitus is important, but it's not only habitus. And I'm not sure that it is the same. I'm not sure that what I'm actually talking about is the same patterns in the villages. And I can give you another example, which probably is somewhere in between your German villages, but it's still Christian. And this is a lecture I heard recently about Ioannina in Greece, the Jews of Ioannina, and a very interesting exchange, cultural exchange. But this is not only cultural exchange. I remember that you were, maybe I'll go first to the habitus, and then I'll go to the more specific examples. So it's not only habitus, because there's all kind of specific contexts. So an habitus, which is a kind of a more synchronic term, you might lose the diachronic context. And I'm talking about late Soviet period, because I think it was not exactly the same in the beginning of the first years of the Soviet Union. The habitus is very important, and of course we are talking about Uzbek Jews, but we are talking also about Jews who speak Judeo-Tajik. They have their own language, and they can speak fluent Uzbek. So it's not only that they are Germans and speak Germany, they speak also Yiddish. They speak their own Yiddish. And the Tajik is connected to other people. So it's very complicated you have to do a contextualization, both synchronic and diachronic here, and habitus is part of it. Now, I had a conversation with a Russian lady, scholar, who lived in Central Asia. And she was sure that she was also a full member of the same habitus. But both the Jews and the Muslims, as I see it as a scholar, don't think so. She was sure. So again, it's a question of perceptions here, and there's also a colonial background here. And the colonial background is very important because there's majority and minority. Now, going back to the Germany, if I remember, this was part of the your Professor Kaplan, your talk said, well, not so much mutual visits to the houses. This is very important. Moving from the marketplace to the house. This is a big change. Intergroup intimacy, as I try to concern, it's very somatic, and it's very sensual. And it goes beyond the marketplace, beyond the school. It goes to the machala, it goes to the houses, all these places. It's also fragile. It's not taken for granted, it's fragile. So this is a difference, and probably we can talk about the different amount of intimacy or something like this. This is something to think about. And also, what is very important to me is, look, Jews and Muslims have more in common from religious point of view than Christians and Jews. And we are talking about traditional communities, although some of my interviewers already went through modernization, were Jewish, but they ate with the Muslims, but they wouldn't eat with the Russians, and only in some circumstances. So this is and last, I'm not sure yet about how to deal, I don't know, with intergroup intimacy in modern Western societies. Because part of the issue here is from the beginning you have kind of a not independent self, but interdependent self. Okay, so people see themselves as connected to others. Germany, in the villages, were still like this, maybe in the towns already not, with the project of modernization.
So thank you very much for the questions. I'll try to very briefly do my best. First of all, before the questions, I have a new study for somebody. Does anyone recall the article from 1979 by Anne Roife in the New York Times called "Christmas Comes to a Jewish Home"? The theme of Christmas trees in American Jewish homes is a big one. And it comes up every year around this time. But it would be lovely to do a comparative study between the role of the Christmas tree in German Jewish homes in the pre-war or interwar, pre-war period, pre-World War I, I would say, and in early 21st century America. Really, that would be a lovely comparative study. So thank you. I'm going to start with Sylvie and Marion, because I think they're related. I don't know a lot about anthropology of family. I read, but I don't consider myself an expert in terms of the different redefinitions, because that's really what you're implying, is that the nuclear family or the classic family or whatever it was, that construction isn't really the necessarily the normative one today in many areas. But there is sort of at least on the popular cultural level, still a sense of family. So I think that you could get bogged down in those details of how do you define family, and maybe for a conference like this, a talk like that would have been the appropriate one to start off the conference. How do we define family? But I think that there is some sense of, in all these talks, we're talking about families, whether it be heterosexual or same-sex, but with parents, children, involvement with community, and I think that that's something that is enough to allow for discourse. In terms of Marion's point about gay marriage, I'll just talk about my friend David Ellenson, who's a very personally traditional Jew. He's a wonderful scholar. He's the president of Hebrew Union College. He will perform gay marriages, but he won't perform intermarriages. So he really, on the issue of gender, he sees no room for distinction, but on the issue of intermarriage, he will not perform. So that really says something. And that I'm using that as a way of going to Chen's question. And it's always lovely when I meet friends and colleagues who spend time in America and are exposed to the richness and complexity of American religious life. Absolutely, when you study ideology, I teach courses, I've written a book about Jewish denominations. There are many distinctions between Reform and Conservative Judaism. Once upon a time, there were big sociological and demographic differences, no more. There are places where there are differences, but really less and less. The people who go attend conservative synagogues could just as easily attend Reform temples. Again, it depends what age group, but if you're talking about the younger you get, the distinctions are less and less. If you look at already 2000 at Stephen Cohen and Arnie Eisen's book, The Jew Within, you really see how the issues of ideology are becoming less and less important, the issues of relating, feeling comfortable, social interaction, etc. And of course there are exceptions. Chabad is the big game breaker, and Chabad is probably the most fascinating thing going on, certainly in American Jewry in the world, because Chabad doesn't demand membership. Anyone can come in, and you can be intermarried, and you can have non-Jewish children. If you have, from a mystical Hasidic point of view, nefesh Yehudi or Yehudiyah, that's enough. And therefore, Chabad is really the ultimate post-denominational framework within American Jewry, and in many ways more tolerant than even Reform temples that do demand some sort of criteria for membership. And I'll end with Uriel Simonson's point. I can't get into it in great detail, but I wouldn't draw any comparisons between Chazal and contemporary Jewry. Obviously, there's a tradition, there's a discourse, and there's a zikaron, a memory. But in terms of historical comparisons, I don't think that there's a lot of room. What I do think is something that I wrote about regarding European Jewry, but I've actually applied it to liberal Jewish groups in America as well, is Judaism works often from an internal ideational perspective or identity perspective, not ideational, identity perspective, in what I refer to in my book, Exclusion and Hierarchy, as hierarchies. That is, that sometimes Jews exclude, but more often than not, they don't want to exclude. At the same time, there's this need, like Mary Douglas talks about the idea of a hierarchy in where there's an ideal state, and then there are gradations below. So that's very obvious when you think about orthodoxy and how orthodoxy in modern times relates to non-observant Jews. It's more interesting, I think, actually, when you think about, let's say, Reform and how they relate to non-Jewish spouses, where essentially what's happening by creating these terms that I talked about, like Karov Yisrael, Yirei Hashem, etc., is there's a broad tent, sort of a broad collective. Within that collective, you have a hierarchy. You have, we'll call it Jews. You can call them non-Jewish Jews. You can call them friends of Jews. But it's a mechanism that's created. And then there are all sorts of interesting ways. You're an anthropologist within the synagogue, how it plays out. Can you get an aliyah? Can you open the Aron Kodesh? Do you count for a minyan? Can you lead a service? Can you be on this committee? Can you be on that committee? And all that is negotiation of that hierarchy, where all the time you're questioning, how do we preserve some sense of, we can call it a constructed authenticity, or of the traditional way, and at the same time be inclusive in order to preserve the collective.
There were a lot of questions. So Sylvie, starting with yours, I define the family as the nuclear plus the extended. So I'm talking about the family that is created, but also the grandparents and the uncles and aunts, because that brings us from the cities usually into the villages. So that's my ideal family and idea of a family. And also it's middle class. So that Jews in Germany in the period I'm looking at, about 15% were from Eastern Europe and were working class, and I'm mostly describing the German Jewish middle class, so that might help a little bit. I wanted to respond also to what Chen was talking about with regard to the differences in our Jews. And the very, very important difference, which you said but didn't get specific enough, you said to contextualize, politics. Extraordinarily important. So if you look at Rwanda, or you look at the ex-Yugoslavia, and you see ethnic groups that either got along very well or got along with certain tensions, you know, as all ethnic groups do have. Some of them get along and some of them have tensions, but enter politics and pour poison on it and create a fire. So I think that's really important, and I guess this the situation in your villages are somewhat different. I mean, they have the socioeconomic disaster. Town, sorry. They have the socioeconomic tensions, but not quite the political tension, which in the Nazi situation comes from the top. I mean, it's geared.
The top here, and the blood libel is an example. There's very clear anti-Semitic tone, and since '67, or even before the breakdown between Russia and Israel, it's not only anti-Semitic, it's also anti-Israeli. So you do have the top, and the Muslims even know about '67, there's slight tensions, but no, it doesn't matter. Still, they are consider them as locals.
That's very, very interesting. So, Vera, the question of social workers and nurses from Germany who come to Palestine, and whether there was no shame to be a single woman. You know the book by Harriet Friedenreich? Okay, so it's Jewish something, professional and single, something like that. An intellectual, or anyway, the point is that she looks at professional women and discovers a good number are single, and even those who are married have many fewer children, even though German Jews don't have many to begin with. I'm not sure that an unmarried professional, I mean, on the one hand, yes, they're respected. On the other hand, whether they're considered blue stockings or failed women because they didn't get married, I'm not so sure that it was so highly respected. So I don't see that as so different. And I don't see it as just Jewish values. Those were German bourgeois values too, to get married and have children. So I think those women had a very hard time. In terms of social workers, Jewish tradition versus German values, the woman who's just, when I wrote my dissertation about Bertha Pappenheim, who was the head of the Jewish feminist movement, she was demanding from the beginning that Jews get together a national Jewish welfare organization. And they didn't till 1917, and that's as a result of the war. But German Protestants and Catholics already had their organization, so I wouldn't say it's purely Jewish. On the other hand, you could show Jewish tradition because there were chevrot, and there were, traditional small Jewish burial societies and dowry societies, and all. So yeah, I mean, you can see a Jewish tradition in it, you can see a German tradition in it. The founder of social work in Germany, of the professional social work in Germany, was Alice Solomon. So there you have, of course, a Jewish woman who in World War I converts to Quakerism or something. But the point is, yeah, so she starts it, and that becomes professional, and it becomes an area where a lot of Jewish women show interest and go into social work. So I'm not surprised to find them in the yeshuv afterwards. Uri Simonson's question is the hardest question, and it's going to take the longest to answer, so I don't know if I should just try a little bit. The question of boundaries and impermeability between cultures and religions. So in the village, I would say culture and religion were one, so that the boundaries were quite clear. Jews could go to the church festival every year and dance and sing with the others, but still, and it's outdoors, it's not in the church, but still it wouldn't be in any way an infringement on their religion. That's what I said in that one paragraph about mothers in the villages could sit and watch their Jewish angels participate in a theater production for Christmas or for Easter without any concern. And that's because they felt very secure in their own Judaism. So they could participate. And why did they go to a Catholic school? Because they had a choice. They could go to the Catholic school or the Protestant school. There were no Jewish schools. So in the villages, you had a religious hour or two a week, and either a rabbi or a Jewish teacher, mostly a Jewish teacher, would come in and teach the kids. And then, you know, the Catholics would go to the priest, and the Protestants would go to their ministers. But there wasn't a sense of anxiety that my child is in a performance, you know, where he's an angel. So I think that, you know, the boundaries are very, very clear. In terms of visiting, one of the things I did say in that little talk was that nobody visited in their homes. Germans didn't visit Germans either. It just wasn't a thing. That becomes a very bourgeois thing later on, where people visit, and if you're not home, they leave their little Visitenkarte, their little visiting card, to show that they came to visit you and that you just weren't there. That's okay if you're not there. But that wasn't a thing that they did in the villages. In the cities, the question's much more difficult. And my first reaction, and I'm sure I would have to modify it many times, is that the cities were far more secular, and so there was a lot of mixing. You have conversion, you have conversion as a result of wanting to get a good job. You have intermarriages that go up to 19% in World War I of men. Women are always lagging behind, but I think that the secularization means that the religion did not create as strict a boundary. And the fact that after 1875 you could intermarry without converting meant that there were also intermarriages without converting. The government made it easier. So my sense is that religion wasn't so much the issue. And I'll give you an example. Gershom Scholem, always good for examples. So his father would light his cigar on the Shabbos candles, okay? He could care less. And the mother kept the Sabbath meal, okay? And then one of the brothers, you know the family, right? So Gershom becomes a Zionist, and one of them becomes a communist, and one of them becomes a nationalist, and I forgot what the other one was. So the communist brings home a non-Jewish wife. The father doesn't want to talk to her. Why? He's not religious. So what is it? It's not nationalism. It's ethnic, whatever, ethnic pride or being an unreasonable father, or God knows what it is, but it's not religion, since the man doesn't care about religion. This woman actually winds up converting to Judaism, so she'd fit into your crowd at some point if she lived in America. But the point is that I think it's very, very complicated, and I'd have to break it down many, many ways. But religion itself, I don't think, is as powerful. And you know, Orthodox behavior and Orthodox, the population of Orthodoxy is between 10 and 15% by 1910. Right. Issue of religion plays a role, well, and specifically in a country in which this word folk is so important. They are German citizens of the Jewish faith, Deutsche Staatsbürger jüdischen Glaubens. Glaubens is beliefs, right? So they are in a society where I said earlier they couldn't become the folk. They can't become peasants, which has a racial connotation. That's the only choice they have. It's to say, you're Protestant, you're Catholic, and we're Jewish of the Jewish faith. But I don't think it really means that much in terms of religious boundaries. I mean, those people who created the Zentralverein were not terribly religious. They were often 3-day Jews. So, I mean, still, they belonged to a synagogue. but I can't really answer beyond that. And I think everybody else, yeah, I think we answered.
Okay, thank you all. I would conclude this very, very interesting session that we had. It was very remarkable, and we saw that there are different talks, but we see that all of them had in common some things that relating to each other in relation to religion, in relation to, first of all, to family and to ethnicity, maybe. And we have many questions which still are pending there, which we'll be able even to talk about them later, or maybe to further and tomorrow, and to further our research as people who are working on the field. I would just want to one thing to mention, talking about the symbols of the other society, maybe the civic features that are attributed now to the Christmas symbols like Christmas tree or the holiday itself. I think we never before did we see in Israel so many Christmas trees as we see them this year. This is a trend which has started specifically after the very big immigration of Russian Jews Jews from Soviet Union, as a matter of fact, to Israel, and little by little it's becoming not only part of the celebration of immigrant of Jews from Russia, but also by Israeli born with no relations to Russia. And look at the cities today, look at the windows of the shops, it's all over this very, very, very festive Christmas tree. And even pardon me?
There was a crafts fair last week in the Beit Tzedek that my wife and daughter went to, and the theme was Christmas, and there was Santa Claus, and there was a tree, and everything was red and white.
People are bringing their home to their homes, even Santa Claus. Yes, so in this very unifying theme, we'll conclude this session, and you are all invited to a reception. We are going to have it in the מרכז המבקרים. Just follow us, okay? Thank you very much.